All right. So, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we are up to the portion Chayei Sarah today. Good morning. And what I thought we would do today is look towards the end of the portion. Chayei Sarah begins, if you're in the Eitz Chaim, on page 127, which I've always found kind of funny because the portion begins with telling us Sarah's age at her death, which is 127. So it's just one of those rare coincidences that the portion begins on 127. I'm kind of that weird kind of guy that would focus on that little detail. Anyway, so the portion begins with telling us about Sarah's death and Abraham's purchase of a burial plot, which turns out to be this cave called Machpelah. And the root word of Machpelah is a word that means multiple. So it's the multiple cave that Abraham buys from Ephron the Hittite. And that is associated with, no, let me say it this way. There is a cave or a tomb in the city of Hebron, which is in the Palestinian territories. Hebron is a city south of Jerusalem. It's south of Bethlehem. So if you go in a straight line south, it's Jerusalem first, then Bethlehem, then Hebron. And in Hebron is this tomb, which has the supposed burial places of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, and also Adam and Eve. So that's where, so it's one thing that this monument is there associated with Abraham, with the patriarchs and matriarchs. That maybe one would imagine historically would have been an important site throughout the ages and would have been revered for centuries, so that you could relatively safely say that yes, that's definitely the spot where all of them are buried. So nobody has done any digging to actually look for bones, but that's the spot that's associated with it. Adam and Eve, that is another question, and that seems very unlikely that Adam and Eve are buried there. Now, because Abraham is also the father of Ishmael, and in the Muslim religion, Ishmael is the founder of the Arab people and the religion of Islam, then Abraham is revered not just in Judaism, but in Islam. And so therefore, it's a mosque inside that monument. So you can go inside and visit, that it was, of course, a site of a massacre. Well, it was a site of, Hebron was a site of a Jewish pogrom before the state of Israel was established. So a couple of times, actually, in the 20s and the 30s, multiple Jews were killed at one time in the city of Hebron. And then Baruch Goldstein on Purim in the 90s massacred Muslims at prayer. So because of the patriarchs and matriarchs being buried there, and the importance to both Judaism and Islam. They have the site then has taken on extremely important significance to the point of people dying there. I don't think, Jan, I'm not sure there is a restriction. There might be a restriction today because it's in Palestinian territory. And I went there when I was on the Hartman program, this 3-year program that for rabbis, 3 summers, 3 weeks in July for 3 years, and then a week in January for 3 years. Part of that program was field trips that we took, and one of them was to the city of Hebron to see how the Israeli army protects the Jewish enclave there, which is a bigger political question. Do the 600 Jews, no, is it 900 Jews require 600 soldiers to protect them? And it gets to the very question of, is it really worth it to maintain Jewish sovereignty in the city of Hebron when it takes that many soldiers to protect them? And what kind of life is that? There's a yeshiva there. Hebron, right next to Hebron is Kiryat Arba, which is in this week's portion. Sarah's lifetime came to 127 years. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron. Okay, so there is Hebron, and right outside Hebron is Kiryat Arba. So there's a yeshiva in Kiryat Arba, and people send their children to this boarding school yeshiva from throughout Israel in order to maintain a Jewish presence in this biblical historical place. So is visitation restricted? I'm not sure. But Jan, if you've been there sooner and more recently than I've been, I wouldn't be surprised if there would be restrictions. There are restrictions for going up onto the Temple Mount. You can only go up a certain time of day and certain days of the week if you are a Jew to go up and onto the Temple Mount. So perhaps it's the same case with Hebron. But all of this—
It's something that Lewis had shared from when Lewis spent his year in Israel, that there were certain cities that you could go if you were American, but if you were Israeli, you could only go on certain times. And I thought that was one of them.
Could be. I wouldn't be surprised, again, because of the authority over Hebron today and the nature of the town today. It's almost like a ghost town right around that cave of Machpelah, because I remember visiting it in the 70s, and it was a bustling tourist attraction. Now, the only thing bustling there are Israeli soldiers keeping the peace, and that's not something personally. It's not something I'm proud of, and certainly not something I would advocate. But this isn't a class on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We'll leave that for another time. But all of this is a tangent to how the portion begins with Sarah's death and the purchase of the burial place. And then the next thing that happens in the second Aliyah is, in chapter 24, is Abraham is getting old. It's not like he wasn't old already. Remember, he was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Possibly and Sarah's 127, so she was 9 years younger. He's 136 when she dies. And then chapter 24, Abraham was now old. So that's a fascinating statement. Like, he's not old already at 136. Now you have to tell us that he's old. So how old is he at this point when he then sends his chief servant, Eliezer, to go to the home country, back to Haran, to find a wife for Isaac. So the bulk of the portion with this very long chapter, chapter 62, which has 67 sentences, is all about that mission to find a wife for Isaac and to bring her back home. Okay, so I don't want to look at that section, at most of that story. I want to look at the end of the story, beginning with verse 62 on page 138. So I want to start there as Rebecca is being brought back to the land of Israel to meet her husband-to-be. So 138 in the Eitz Chaim, or chapter 24, beginning with verse 62. So, V'yitzchak ba mibo. So, Isaac had just come back. That's how it's translated. So, ba mibo, a very unusual Hebrew phrasing. I don't have much to say about it, except that it's very unusual. So, the literal translation would be, and Isaac came from coming, be'er lachai ro'i, to or from be'er lachai ro'i. Now, so the came from coming is just an unusual way of talking. It's an unusual phrasing. You wouldn't talk like that in English. So what does that mean? Came from coming, and the commentary doesn't even say anything about it. And a different translation, Robert Alter's translation, all it says was had come from the approach to Be'er Lachai Ro'i. So that's how he translates it. He came from the approach, like he was on the outskirts of Be'er Lachai Ro'i, and Vehu Yoshev Be'eretz HaNegev, and he was settled in the Negev, in the region of the Negev. So the Negev is from Be'er Sheva all the way to Eilat. That's the Negev desert. Maybe a little bit north of Be'er Sheva it starts. So if you can picture the map of Israel in your mind's eye, Hebron, where Sarah is buried, is northeast of Be'er Sheva. Where this Be'er Lachai Ro'i is unclear, but the Negev is also then southwest of Hebron. So somewhere Isaac is in that region. Vayetze Yitzchak, verse 63. Vayetze Yitzchak. So in other words, the Torah is trying to give us a specific place where Isaac is at this time, and there isn't a specific place. He had been on the outskirts of Be'er Lachai Ro'i, and he's somewhere in the Negev. So in other words, how is Rebecca and the caravan supposed to find Isaac if there isn't an exact location here to find him? Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. Isaac went out, lasuach basadeh. It's translated here, walking in the field, or the Robert Alter translation is taking a stroll. Lasuach, though, is, I understand it, because the rabbis understand it, he was out meditating in the field. And if we can understand it as meditating, and I'm surprised that the English translations don't incorporate something like that into the English translation, because a sicha, a conversation, could be related to the word suach. Vav and yud are often interchangeable in root letters and forms of words in Hebrew. So sicha is in modern Hebrew as a conversation, and so it would make sense that the kind of walk that he's taking is a meditative kind of walk, kind of like strolling, not for a leisurely sense of just, but more of a spiritual kind of walk, walking with the intent of kind of focusing on nature around you, listening to the wind. So if it's in the Negev, there's not much nature around you. It's sand and barren desert, but there are, if you listen carefully when you're out in the desert, you hear the wind, and you could hear other things there in nature. So he was strolling in the field, lifnot arev, toward evening. So toward evening, twilight time, dusk time in the desert is a very interesting time to be out in a desert climate, because the temperature is changing as the sun is going down. It's getting cold, and the breeze picks up as well. Vayisa einav, and he lifted his eyes, or he looked up. Isaac looked up. Vayar, and he saw or noticed. Vehine gemalim ba'im, camels are approaching. 64. Vatisa Rivka et eineha, and Rivka looked up. She lifted up her eyes. So the perspective is changing from Isaac's perspective to Rebekah's perspective. Isaac is walking, taking this spiritual walk, and lifts up his eyes and see camels. Now we shift in verse 64 to Rebekah. She lifts her eyes, Vatera et Yitzchak, and she sees Isaac. So that's interesting too. From Isaac's perspective, he sees camels. From Rebekah's perspective, she sees Isaac. Are they equidistant? In other words, is the narration telling us at the exact same moment that Isaac and Rebekah are looking up or lifting their eyes? So Isaac, when he lifts his eyes, sees camels in the distance. Rebekah, when she lifts her eyes or looks up, she sees Isaac in the distance. So it's one thing to see a group of camels walking by, which you can probably make out from a greater distance, but to see a person walking, that's kind of hard to see from a great distance. So it's probably not at the same time. The narration isn't just jumping at the same moment. So she lifts up her eyes, she sees Isaac, and what does she do? Vatipol me'al hagamal. So literally, she fell off the camel. But it could be she alighted from the camel, or yes, alighted from the camel. So it's not falling off. She just got off in the normal way. So she sees Isaac. How does she know it's Isaac? So yes, Barbara, unmute yourself.
Isn't it also a matter of perspective?
Yeah.
She's on the camel, and there are other camels, but when she's looking at him, it's not in the same direction. They're not looking at the same thing.
Right. No, that's true.
If they're facing each other, they're not going to see the same thing.
No, that's true. But all I'm pointing out was that the Torah makes it seem as if the two people looking, Isaac and Rebekah, it seems they're looking at the exact same time, just the way the Torah is presenting it. And if they're looking at each other at the exact same time, then the question arises, why does Isaac see camels? Why doesn't it say Yitzchak lifts up his eyes and sees Rebekah? Because 64, Rebekah lifts up her eyes and she sees Isaac. It's just interesting that the Torah is presenting it in that way. He lifts up his eyes, he sees camels. She lifts up her eyes, she sees Isaac. What I don't have anything to say about it except that it's interesting the perspective that each has of the other. Okay, and again, this is a narration that implies that this is a history that we're seeing, that events are actually happening. But if it's a story that is recounted centuries later from oral tradition, then it's a different question that we would be asking. Why in the oral tradition are the details maintained in such a way that Isaac notices camels, but Rebecca notices Isaac? It's just interesting, and perhaps it relates to what Rebecca notices in the beginning of the story, which we didn't read, right? Because Eliezer makes a vow to God that the first woman that he sees at the well, who will offer drink both to the camels and to him, will be one who is destined to marry Isaac. And lo and behold, Rebecca is the first one, and she does offer drink to the camels and to Eliezer. So Eliezer says, "Oh God, thank you for listening to my prayer and answering fulfilling this vow." So if she notices people in distress, people who are thirsty, and animals who are thirsty as well. She's a compassionate person. So maybe the fact that she sees Isaac or notices Isaac says something about her personality. What it says about Isaac, that he sees camels and doesn't see Rebecca, that I'm not sure, because we're going to see something in just a verse or two about him. So let's just raising that as an interesting point, literary point. So verse 65, Vatomer el ha'eved, she says to the servant, not sure which servant, but to a servant who's accompanying the caravan, Mi ha'ish halazeh haholech basadeh likratenu. Who is the man? Who is this man who is walking in the field coming to meet us? Now, isn't that interesting that in verse 64, the Torah tells us that Rivka sees Isaac. But in verse 65, she asks, who is this man that she sees? So why did the Torah write it that way? Why didn't the Torah say she sees a man in the distance and asks the servant who it is, and then the servant tells her who it is? So it's just weird that, or strange literarily, that she sees Isaac, asks the servant, who is this man? Vayomer ha'eved, and the servant says, Hu Adoni, he is my master. Vatikachat sa'if vatitkas, and she took the scarf or the veil, and she vatitkas, and became covered. So she veiled herself at the moment she recognized. So the servant is Eliezer, because Eliezer is not named in this story, but he is the servant who accompanies Rebecca and her entourage. So she asks, and the servant Eliezer says, it's my master, Isaac, assumed he's saying Isaac. And so therefore she covers herself, which gives us, by the way, the basis for Jewish brides veiling themselves at a wedding. So that's why traditionally are Jewish women, why do they wear a veil when they get married? Because of what Rebecca does here. She recognizes that this is her betrothed that she's about to meet, so she veils herself. 66, Vayesaper ha'eved leYitzchak, the servant told Isaac, et kol hadvarim asher asa, all the things that happened. So the 65 verses that came before, Eliezer tells Isaac the whole story. Right now, it doesn't say anything here about Rebekah and Isaac formally meeting each other, or saying hello to each other, or Isaac asking the servant, who is this woman who has veiled herself? Nothing like that is being described to us. So that's fascinating too. Rebekah's doing all the questions and she's doing all the actions. Isaac is just spiritually walking in the field, which according to the rabbis is the basis for davening mincha. It's from here that we get, so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the people who began praying the morning, afternoon, and evening services. So it's this story when he's going out in the field, strolling in the field toward evening, that is the basis for the mincha service in late afternoon. So why isn't Isaac asking the servant, who is this woman? And why isn't the servant saying to Isaac, she's the one who your father sent me on a mission to get so that you would have someone to marry? None of that happens here. It just assumes, the Torah assumes that we know that that's what's about to take place. And verse 67, the end of the chapter, Vayevieha Yitzchak ha'ohala Sarah imo. Isaac brought her to the tent of Sarah, his mother. Vayikach et Rivka, and he took Rebekah, which is the formal taking, which is marrying. So Isaac marries Rebekah, Vatihi lo leisha, and she became his wife. Vaye'ehaveha, and he loved her. Not they loved each other, not she loved him, but he loved her. Vayinachem Yitzchak acharei imo, and Isaac was consoled or comforted after his mother. Now the English says after his mother's death, but after his mother. So this whole little cryptic story. So let me say this way: the whole chapter provided tremendous detail. 61 verses of the chapter, tremendous detail for the Eliezer's mission, ending up in Haran at the well, meeting Rebekah offering water for the camels and for him, meeting Rebekah's brother, meeting the whole family, telling then Rebekah and the family what he is there to do. And he repeats everything, and the Torah repeats it. In other words, the Torah doesn't say, and then Eliezer told the whole family everything that happened to this point, one sentence. No, everything is repeated in detail. Exactly. So we have extra sentences in the Torah when we don't normally have extra sentences. And then Eliezer and Rebekah leave with lots of gifts as a dowry and coming back. And then if we have all those details that are even repeated, why does it end so cryptically? If we want details, I think that we would be more interested in the details of 67, right? In verse 66, the servant told Isaac all the things that happened. That's what could have been said in earlier in the chapter when Eliezer told Rebekah's family everything that happened. But no, in other words, we could have had 20 more sentences now where Eliezer tells the whole story again for a third time. So that the Torah doesn't do. But then in verse 67, Isaac took her to his mother's tent, and took her, Rebekah, to wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was consoled or comforted after his mother. Well, I'd like to know, like, what that meeting was all about, and how was it that Isaac grew to love Rebekah? And why isn't it that Rebekah loved Isaac? Why doesn't it say that Rebekah loved Isaac? Why does it only say that Isaac loved Rebekah? Why? Why does Isaac love Rebekah? So all of this is left to the imagination, which is then, if we look on the bottom below the line with verse 67, Isaac comes to love Rebekah after he marries her, right? He marries her, and then it says, and he loved her. Their love is the result, not the prerequisite of their relationship. And the commentary then assumes that they're loving each other. But the Hebrew says only that he loved her. So if they loved each other, vayehavu. That's how it would be in the Hebrew. Vayehavu. That would mean they loved each other. Vayehaveha means he loved her. Yes, Jan.
So often, you're more expert than me, but often, like, the women aren't even named.
Right.
Women, like, there's not usually expressions of what the woman is thinking, feeling, saying, whatever. Right. So could it be looked at through that lens that, all right, we're telling the man's story, and in the man's story, he loved her, not really looking at the woman's story. And you know what, for this woman, that she has a name, like, that's the big plus for her.
Okay, but we also have to know the entire story, even what comes next in next week's portion, so that we know that Rebekah is a very active woman and a proactive woman, the woman who's taking charge in the relationship of this particular generation. When it's Abraham and Sarah, it's mostly Abraham. Sarah does some things, and it's recorded that she's done some things, but it's mainly Abraham that is doing the things. In the Isaac-Rebekah part of the story, it's mainly Rebekah. So Rebekah is the one who is leaving the home country to meet Isaac. She sees Isaac, and again, he sees camels, but he does marry her, and he loves her. But in next week's story, she's the one who's going to be praying to God. He prays on her behalf too, but she prays as well. She goes first to pray because of the twins inside of her. And then she tells Jacob to dress up like Esau to get the blessing. So Rebekah is the more proactive partner in this relationship. Isaac, mostly things happen to him. He digs wells, right? He digs wells, but the Philistines fill them in until finally they reach an agreement for them not having to fill in the wells anymore, and he gets to keep a well. But that's really, there's nothing that really that Isaac, right? And he's brought to Mount Moriah by his father, nearly sacrificed by his father. So things happen to him. He's the only patriarch, by the way, who spends his entire life in the land of Israel. Abraham, the first 75 years of his life are outside of Israel, and then he's told by God to leave Haran to go to Israel. So most of his life is in the land of Israel, but the first 75 years not. And Jacob also goes down to Egypt and dies in Egypt from escaping famine in the land of Israel. So that Isaac is the only one to spend his entire life in the land of Israel. Yes, Sumner.
You may have already talked about this, but did the rabbis ever try to explain the ages that are mentioned?
No, they
125 years
right.
old. What happened?
They don't really say anything remarking about the unusual age. No, they spend a lot of time talking about Moses's age of 120, but they don't say anything like it's remarkable how long Abraham lived, or Isaac, or Jacob. And they don't really spend much time on even the ages of the generations before, which were people living in their 800s and 900s. So no, they don't really spend the time with that. So again, I just remark about the detail in the story, or the lack thereof, and also where there is detail. Why spend all the time talking about all the detail leading up to finding a wife for Rebecca, and no detail about the process of becoming a married couple? So it's just interesting that if the story were told in our day and age, it would be all about the romance and the nature of the relationship, and not about the process leading up to getting married. Okay. The other comment below the line about being comforted, after Isaac being comforted after his mother. So below the line here, after his mother's death, as long as Sarah was alive, a light shone over her tent, signifying the divine presence. When she died, it disappeared. When Rebecca arrived, it returned. So that's a famous midrash about this, that what is so significant about Sarah's tent. And it's a kind of a holy place, because the Shekhinah, God's presence, hovered over the tent. And that there is this midrash that the Shekhinah left when she died, and the Shekhinah came back when Isaac brought Rebecca into the tent. And it says Rebecca does not replace Isaac's mother. She fills the emotional void in his life. So there's a lot of midrash, or at least modern midrash, that try to help us understand psychologically who Isaac is, what kind of person is Isaac. And it's related in part to how old Isaac may have been at the time of Abraham bringing him to Mount Moriah, to the near sacrifice. So whatever age he was, that near-death experience was a psychologically transformative experience for Isaac. That is clear, but the Torah does not tell us any details about what was, how Isaac may have been psychologically affected. We only know from scant references that Abraham and Isaac went their separate ways coming down from Mount Moriah, and we only see Abraham and Isaac together again when Abraham dies. So it's not on his deathbed. He dies, and then Isaac and Ishmael come together to bury their father next to their mother. So there's nothing that the Torah describes of Abraham and Isaac having an encounter again in life after the Mount Moriah experience. So there's that modern writers have something to say about. And also the fact that here, cryptically, we're told that Isaac is comforted after his mother's death. That says something too. Like, nobody else in the Torah is described as feeling grieved for the death of a parent. That all the generations from Adam till Abraham, not one of them said anything about, and he was sorry for the death of his father, or he mourned his father for 30 days. It doesn't, nothing like that. So we have no experience in the Torah of a description of mourning or grief. We do have at the beginning of this portion, Abraham cries for the death of Sarah. It says, it says in verse 2, Sarah, on page 127, Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron and land of Canaan, and Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and bewail her. Okay, so that's the first description of any kind of mourning. And then when he's done mourning her, then he buys a burial plot for her. Okay, so that raises questions too. But anyway, we don't know. And how old was Isaac when he's brought up to Mount Moriah? And was it really a near-death experience too? There's tons of midrash about what Isaac experienced on the altar that Abraham tied him to. That he saw God, he saw the angels in God's heavenly court. Angels were crying, and a teardrop or two landed in Isaac's eyes, because later in next week's story, it tells us that Isaac grew old and his eyes dimmed. So that we weren't told that Abraham's eyes dimmed. So because Isaac's eyes dimmed, there's midrash there that's from the tears of the angels that fell into Isaac's eyes. Yes, Sumner, unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself, Sumner.
Was Isaac 37 years old when?
Right, so I'm getting there. Yes, so that there are those who suggest that Isaac was 37 because right after the Mount Moriah experience, at least in the Torah, right after the Mount Moriah experience, we're told that Sarah's 127 and she dies. The rabbis make the assumption that she died right after Mount Moriah happened, where in the Torah, it's not necessarily the case. We don't know for sure how many years it was after Mount Moriah that she died, but there's plenty of interesting midrash that connects her death to what happened at Mount Moriah, that she died because she thought that Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac there, that she couldn't handle life anymore with the spiritual Abraham who would take the son that they waited their entire lives for so randomly up to Mount Moriah upon the saying that he heard God talk to him and command him to do this. So the midrash suggests that, and so and we know that Sarah was 100 when we know that Sarah was 90. Sarah was 90 when Isaac was born, and if she's 127 when she dies, and if she died right after the Mount Moriah experience, then that means that Isaac was 37.
Yeah.
So if all that's the case, that's a lot of assumptions there, and that's why, according to that makes it an interesting question. Why would a 37-year-old follow his father up Mount Moriah? And why would a 37-year-old be called a young man in the Hebrew itself? Right, he's called, wait a second, I'm just looking for the word. Yes, in verse 12 in chapter 22, the angel says to Abraham, Al tishlach yadcha el hana'ar. Don't cast your hand, or don't raise your hand against the boy. Na'ar in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, is boy. So why would a 37-year-old be called a boy? If he's 37 at this point, he shouldn't be called a na'ar. He could be called Ben, your son, because you're someone's son, no matter how old you are. But to be called the descriptive of boy, that's unusual, if not wrong, to be calling a 37-year-old a boy. Yes, Barbara.
Isn't it also was unusual for a man to wait until he's 37 plus to get married?
Well, so that if we look at the genealogies from Abraham, from Adam to Abraham, no, that's not unusual. And in fact, that would be quite young, 37, because some of them were a couple hundred years old before having a child. So the age, I wouldn't make anything of the age in terms of getting married. I only make something of the age because if the rabbis say, and they do in their midrash, that Isaac was 37 at the time of the binding this story on Mount Moriah, then why is the Torah referring to him as a Na'ar? Which leads to modern midrash that perhaps Isaac was somehow emotionally or intellectually disabled. There is modern midrash that suggests that, and that even though he was 37, he was emotionally or intellectually like a boy. Which gets into then why Rebecca takes more of an active role in the story of Isaac and Rebecca, and why perhaps Eliezer is looking for a certain kind of woman who would be able to take care of such a man as Isaac is, someone who is intellectually and or emotionally challenged, someone who is compassionate, someone who is able to see the person for who he is. And maybe that helps us understand why Isaac sees camels in the distance, but Rebecca sees Isaac in the distance. It says something more about who Rebecca is as a person, as a perceptive person, a caring, compassionate person who is able to see the person at whatever distance and see them for who they are. Whereas Isaac, because of his disability, is not able to distinguish even between a camel and a person. Perhaps. I mean, it's not more of a stretch to come up with this midrash than the other midrash that the rabbis themselves came up with 1,500 years ago. Okay, it just lends itself more interestingly. And Sarah is the one who took care of Isaac, and to be comforted by Rebecca makes sense in that he finally he was able to trust Rebecca and to be able to love her in a way that he knew he would be taken care of. So all of these things I just come out of all these cryptic 5 sentences at the end of chapter 24. So, yes, Gabe.
I remember reading, I think in a midrash, that after the binding, Isaac went off to a yeshiva run by none other than my namesake, Eber.
Yes, that is possible that happened as well. Yes, there is a midrash about the yeshiva of Shem ve'ever, as it's pronounced in Hebrew, Shem and Eber, that were the son and grandson of Noah. So this is a whole, and this gets into next week's portion also, in that why are the twins fighting or kicking a lot in Rebecca's womb? Because whenever Rebecca passed by a place of idol worship, Esau would be kicking, wanting to get out to worship idols. And whenever she passed by the yeshiva of Shem and Ever, Jacob was kicking because he wanted to get out to study in the yeshiva. So there's that classic midrash there. But yes, so that yeshiva of Shem and Ever is there throughout that possibly Abraham studied there as well. Lots of midrash about that. That's only for the rabbi's purpose, just a second, for the rabbi's purpose of extending rabbinic Judaism all the way back to the time of the patriarchs and matriarchs, right? For the rabbis, they want to ensure for posterity that their interpretations were not unique to themselves, that they were not creating something out of whole cloth, but rather their system goes all the way back in the Torah. So they created the stories of the yeshiva of Shem and Ever. That was the beginning of rabbinic thought. Yes, Sumner.
How did the rabbis establish yeshivas back
Well,
then?
right, of course, it doesn't make sense, but none of this makes sense historically. Okay, so again, everything, we have to put history aside, and we have to, at least this is my perspective, we cannot confuse Torah with science and history. It is not, clearly for me, the Torah is not meant to be teaching us science or history. Torah is meant to be teaching us moral, ethical, and religious lessons. So the details that we might be looking for in a story are not there because the point of the story is to teach us ethical, moral, and religious values. It's not to teach us that, yes, the world was created in 6 days, and that's the science and biology that happened. No, that's not the point of the story of the creation of the world. The point of the story of the creation of the world is look at the world around us, how miraculous it is. God must have created the world. Okay, so that's a point that still it can be argued today. Scientists might be able to prove that Big Bang happened, but can they prove how the Big Bang happened? I don't think scientists still can explain how the Big Bang happened. So you can't disprove that God exists. So the point of the Torah is that God exists and God created this world. Okay, so and there here, who are the original people of humanity that led to who we are as a Jewish people? That's the point of this story. So whether there was a yeshiva of Shem and Ever or not, that gets to the rabbinic perspective, that where did rabbinic Judaism come from? It's fine for me as a religious Jew today to say that the rabbis created Judaism. I don't have a problem with that. And Judaism has been around 2,000 years because of the rabbis. Thanks to the rabbis for creating the system, because had they not, Judaism would have, the Jewish people would have disappeared after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. Were it not for the rabbis creating this system, we would not be around today as a Jewish people. I'm convinced of that. So it is fine with me to say that the rabbis created Judaism as we know it, based on the elements from the Torah itself. But for the rabbis, that's not enough. They were uncomfortable creating something new. They wanted their system to have a basis all the way back in the Torah, and that's why they created the stories of Shem and Ever. That's why they insisted that Abraham kept kosher. That's why they insisted that all the patriarchs and matriarchs followed Torah law and rabbinic law, because how could it not be? But so for how we understand the Torah today, it all depends on our own personal religious perspectives. But how we read the Torah should definitely be with a religious lens, not with a science or a history lens. Absolutely not intended that way. Okay, so let's stop here for today. We will meet again next Wednesday is November 3rd. November 10th, we will not be meeting. On November 10th, I will be in Philadelphia helping my parents move out of their apartment and come down to the Ring House. So that'll be an all-day affair. I will not be able to teach Torah study on Wednesday morning, November 10th. So I'll remind you all again next week about that. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.